Okay, so without further ado, I present to you Janet Vasquez and Yendri Diaz. You can go ahead and start.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. We're really excited to be here, and what better way than a Friday night than to talk about ABA? So for me, this is an absolute pleasure. So thank you to everybody who showed up, and we're just so honored to be able to offer this information. And thank you to Ivan and Annabelle for allowing us to share this information, and obviously to UM-CARD. So the topic of today is all things ABA, an introduction to ABA. And as Ivan mentioned, this is the first webinar in a three-part series. So just to give you an overview of what we're going to touch on today, is we're going to kick off with just a little bit of an introduction, tell you a little bit about myself, and then I'll hand over to the floor to Yendri so she can tell you about her, and then tell you a little bit about our goals for the mini-series, and a little bit about Kidvincible. And then that'll be a brief, and then from there we'll move into answering some key questions for you guys about ABA. So first off, what is ABA? What is behavior? How does behavior work? And then once you start learning all these things, how to start putting some of these things together in a very tangible way for your child at home. And then obviously at the end, one of the things that's so important to Yendri and I is that we are here to answer any questions that you may have, because you'll see as I move to the next slide, one of the main goals that we have for this series is to empower you with some tangible tools that you can use immediately at home. So this is us. So I'm Janet, and just a little background about me. I'm a board certified behavior analyst, and I've been in the field for 20 years. I can't believe it's been that long, but I love what I do, and I can't imagine doing anything else. Currently, I'm serving as the Chief Executive Officer of a company called ABA Squad, and it specializes in ABA services or ABA therapy to children with autism. But when I'm not running that company, another thing that I love to do is present at conferences and also teach undergraduate courses at Florida International University. So Yendri, I'd love for you to speak a little bit about you.
Thank you, Janet. Hi guys, thank you everyone for coming in to learn about the webinar today. And thank you Ivan and Annabelle for hosting. My name is Yendri Diaz. I'm also a behavior analyst. I got my undergraduate at FIU, and then I did my master's in behavior analysis in California. I specialize in disseminating ABA, so I'm pretty much in the education sector. I focus on training at the different levels within the board requirements, so at the RBT level, at the BCABA, the BCBA, providing a lot of consultation for ABA companies, and then conducting a lot of parent training as well. So the topic of being able to bring these principles to utilize in the home is really a passion for us, and we're really happy to be with you guys today.
So on that note, that's a beautiful segue into a deeper dive into our goals of the mini-series. So right at the top, the first bullet, you can see that, and I alluded to this just a minute ago, is to teach you about basic principles that affect behavior. And don't be deceived by the word basic, because these are very, very powerful principles that can really make a difference. And Yendri and I, in all of our years of experience, we're definitely drinking the Kool-Aid and have seen the power of these principles, as well as how these principles can be implemented in a meaningful way at home to produce behavior change. And then along that, the second goal that we have of this mini-series is that we want to make an impact in your lives. And now we know that we can't be there, especially in light of where we are. And this was definitely fueling this mini-series, that right now we're living the quarantine life, as they say, and we can't be there in your home with you now. But the purpose of this webinar is to give you those tools, empower you, so that way you can be armed with strategies that can help you at home with your children. And as a byproduct of that, be able to increase the quality of your daily life. So as you may have seen in the flyer, this mini-series is comprised of 3 different webinars, each honing in on a particular topic, all related to ABA, and they definitely build on one another. So as I mentioned, the webinar for today is an introduction. So think of this webinar as laying the foundation. And the terms and the principles that you're going to learn today, you're going to see have a direct connection to webinar 2, which is all about preventing and decreasing problem behavior. And I hope that got your ears tuned up, because I know if I was sitting in your shoes, I would definitely be signing up for that webinar. And then webinar 3 is also a direct connection to webinar 1, because those principles and strategies in webinar 1 are going to be tied to webinar 3, which is all things about teaching and maintaining skills. So in applied behavior analysis, it's definitely 2 sides of the equation, if you will. One side is that we have to address problem behavior, and there's a specific way to do that. But then we also, when we address those problem behaviors, we have to also focus on teaching. So it's never, in behavior analysis, in applied behavior analysis, I should say, it's never one or the other. It's always a 2-pronged approach that we take. Okay, now that you have an idea of our goals for you and you have the structure of the webinar, I want to just introduce very, very briefly a little bit about the Kidvincible program. And this was a program, it really was a passion project for myself and Yendri as practitioners in the field for many, many years. And we saw that there was a need to have a program that could really equip families with strategies that could help them directly at home, but also if you're currently receiving ABA services, it could help enhance that service. And so that way you're in a much better position to dive in and work with your clinical team to produce the most efficacious or to get the most efficacious outcomes. And so, just as I mentioned, the Kidvincible program is a training program that helps parents, behavior analysts, and ABA companies implement the science of applied behavior analysis to achieve the highest learning outcomes for the kids. So at the end of the day, everything we do is for the betterment of the children that we serve. Now, whether that you're working with a behavior analyst or you're working with a behavior therapist, whatever level practitioner, at the end of the day, the goal is to, increase independence and to help the children that they're working with. Now, this mini-series is a very, very small, truncated version of the full program. So if you're interested in the Kidvincible full program, that's actually a 4-week program that is a hybrid program in the sense that there's an online component and there's a face-to-face component. Now, in times like these, the face-to-face may be like this, but once we come out of that, we do arrange for a face-to-face training component in office. And that training program equips parents with many different tools that come from the program. So you're equipped with a handbook that is replete with easy to apply, detailed instructions on how to use the very information that you are learning into your day-to-day life with your children. And if you are somebody that's currently receiving ABA services, as I just mentioned, this can really help you get the most out of the services that you're receiving. So now that we've done that introduction, let's really dive into the content for today, because that's why you guys are here. So let's tackle this first question of what is applied behavior analysis. And you guys as parents have probably been hearing this ABA thing for a while. And so what we want to do is just give you a straightforward answer of what this ABA, which stands for applied behavior analysis, is. And in a nutshell, ABA is a science. And it's a science that has been tried and true and is tested and it has given us reliable outcomes that we can trust because of that consistent testing. And what it gives us is a specific methodology that we can apply to either increase a behavior in the case of skill acquisition, or in other cases to decrease a behavior if we're talking about targeting a problem behavior. So when we talk about the goals of ABA, we're talking about, first of all, to improve and understand human behavior. So at the end of the day, applied behavior analysis is a science that's all about improving and understanding human behavior. So my behavior, Yendri's behavior, your behavior. Another goal in ABA is to identify what affects human behavior. So we have to understand it, but in order to understand it, we have to understand what are the things that are going on that ultimately make a behavior or not make a behavior occur. So that's what we mean by effect. And then, but as I mentioned beforehand, at the end of the day, ABA is all about producing socially significant behavior. So, and one of the things that I had mentioned that I teach undergraduate courses at Florida International University, and one of the things I always tell my students is that when you learn these robust principles, it really empowers you to change behavior, and any behavior, but it doesn't mean that any behavior is worth changing. We're in the business of changing behavior that makes a difference, and that's what we mean by socially significant. So a perfect example that I'll give you from a practitioner point of view is when I sit down and I do my first consultation with a family, I'm going to be asking them, what's important to you? What do you need? What are the goals for your family? And the reason I'm asking those questions is because as a practitioner, that's pointing me in the direction of what is socially significant behavior for you and your family. Because at the end of the day, ABA is about producing that change. And then along with that, in order to produce socially significant behavior, we obviously need to address the problematic behavior. And I imagine that some of you are here because the flyer gave information about decreasing problem behavior, and you're thinking to yourself, yeah, there's some behaviors that, I'd really like my child not to do, and I'd like to learn about these strategies that could help me with that. And that's what ABA is all about. Okay, so throughout this presentation, because it's so important to us that we're presenting the information in a way that is digestible to you, that we have what we call active student responding questions. So Ivan, if you could be so kind to put up our first poll question, and based on the information that I just gave about ABA, let's take a stab at our first question here. And no pressure, you don't have to answer, but if you want to dive in, then I say go for it. So the question is, what does ABA stand for? Is it A, awareness by analysis, B, applied bystander awareness? That sounds pretty cool. C, applied behavior awareness, or D, applied behavior analysis? So I'll just pause for a minute and give you guys a moment to respond. Okay, you guys are a super sharp bunch. I see everybody responded with applied behavior analysis. So kudos to you. Great job on that. All right, let's keep moving through here. Okay, so now that we know what applied behavior analysis is, and you guys definitely showed me in that last what we call ASR, active student responding question, that you guys are right on point, you know what that is. So now let's tackle our second question. And our second question is, what is behavior? So when we dive into behavior, really, we can get into these really technical definitions, but at the end of the day, behavior includes anything that we do. So walking, talking, eating, these are all behaviors that we do. Now, there is something that I have to focus on when we talk about behavior, and that's the next 3 bullets. A behavior analyst focuses on behavior that is observable, so we need to be able to see it. It's describable, so we need to be able to describe what it looks like. So we need to be able to write down what it looks like, and it needs to be measurable. And as we move along, we'll talk more about the importance of measuring behavior. But for now, to keep us on track, these are the three things that we look for when we are targeting behavior. Is it observable? Can we see it? Can we describe it? And can we measure it? And at the end of the day, what you will encounter if you're either someone that's pursuing ABA services or you are already receiving ABA services, which is great, is that your practitioner, your behavior analyst, will be honing in on those behaviors that they can observe, describe, and measure. So here at the bottom, you see some more examples. So things like hitting, definitely not a behavior that we want, but it's still something we can observe, describe, and measure. Things like hugging, things like running. Now notice, and let's compare and contrast our examples to our non-examples. So our non-examples, and what we mean by this are behaviors that a behavior analyst will not target, because in terms of our strict parameters of what constitutes behavior in applied behavior analysis, it doesn't fit the bill. So those include things like not listening, so not engaging in a behavior. In our strict definition is not a behavior, because not doing something doesn't fit the criteria. It's not observable, it's not describable, and if they're not doing something, is it really measurable? Things like anger and madness, now, and being even happy. Now, I know if I was sitting in your shoes, I'd be thinking, well, I think I can see anger. I think I can see when someone's happy. And what a behavior analyst would say is, instead of targeting the anger, which we all can agree is an emotion, what we would do is we would target the behaviors that are characteristic, that denote anger. So things like maybe a frown on their face or burrowing their eyebrows. And another example would be happy. So a behavior analyst, if let's say, I'm your behavior analyst and you say, you know, I really need to work on my child's anger. And that is a very important issue that you're bringing up. But what you will see a behavior analyst do, and certainly a behavior analyst will bring forth a treatment plan and all the components that they plan to move forward with. You won't see anger in their plan as a targeted behavior, but you might see some of those behaviors that denote that. So that's where behavior analysis is very, very strict, because when we continue this series, you'll see how this very strict parameters for how behavior analysts, target behavior and choose to categorize behavior, I should say, really relates to the treatment plan and the data collection that follows that process. Okay, so at the end of the day, and you guys will see that we love to do this, give you, real takeaways, little things, little tidbits that you can walk away with. When you talk about behavior, you're talking about focusing on actions. And by focusing on actions, that's how we can create behavior change, because we can observe it, we can measure it, and we can describe it. Okay, so moving on with this topic of what is behavior, we have to talk about some examples and non-examples. So I gave you a few here to work with. And so first, I'm going to give you some examples of how to describe what the person is doing. So an example, because that was one of the parameters for behavior, you can describe it. So an example would be, Rudy cried for 5 minutes and then he hit me, right? So there you're being very, you're in a very tangible way, you're describing what the person is doing, right? He cried, and he cried for 5 minutes, and then after he cried for 5 minutes, he hit me. Whereas a non-example, so something that a behavior analyst wouldn't be able to target, are like the next bullet. Rudy didn't like what I said and was really angry at me, so he hit me. Now you guys will see, we're going to start to introduce some terms as we move on, but you'll see that when we describe behavior as something like anger, you'll see that it's very, very hard to make the connection to another piece that really helps you understand this larger picture of what really triggered and produced that behavior. So now, when we refer to what they are not, they are doing, not what they aren't doing. So an example is, I told Johnny to clean up his desk and he turned around and walked away. So a non-example would be, I said to clean his desk and he didn't listen. So let's really digest these two examples. So in the first example, you described that you told Johnny to clean up his desk, right? You could see that. And then he turned around and walked away. That's something, again, you can see, you can describe, you can measure. But then let's now look at the second example. So you told him to clean up his desk and he didn't listen. So that goes back to the previous slide of not doing something is not a behavior that we would target. Because if he didn't listen, well, how do I know he didn't listen? What are the behaviors that denote him not listening? So instead, in the previous bullet, we would then target things that we can see, like him turning around or walking away. Okay, so let's keep going here. Okay, so now that you have an idea of what behavior is, and that it focuses on actions, right, that are observable, measurable, and describable, let's take a stab at this next ASR. So Ivan, if you can be so kind, he's on super on the wall. He already has the next one on there. So let's try this next question. Which of the following is an example of behavior? Is it A, getting mad, B, not completing a task, running, C, or D, none of the above? So I'm just going to give a few moments. I see some of you guys are super fast responders, super sharp, already chimed in, but I see a few more responses coming in. Okay, so this is a great question, and I see that I have a mixed bag of answers, and that tells me that this is a great topic to talk about. So the correct answer is running, and I see that some of the responses were leaning towards getting mad, and I'm really, really happy to say that nobody thought it was not completing the task, which means that I did my job well, that not doing something, you guys now know, means that's not behavior. So now let's talk about getting mad, right? And I remember when I was first a student of behavior analysis, I remember I challenged my professor and I said, but I can see getting mad. I can see somebody getting happy. How can you tell me that's not behavior? And the reason being is because when you talk about somebody being mad, it really is comprised of a multitude of behaviors if you really look at it. So I encourage you guys and I invite you guys, when for the rest of your day, if let's say you're talking to someone and you see them being happy or you see them getting frustrated or you see them getting mad, I invite you and encourage you to really start to, after this webinar, take a look and see what specific behaviors are they engaging in. And that's why the getting mad is not the answer that we're looking for here, because as I said, mad is really a compilation of behaviors. The behaviors that we would target are those specific behaviors that denote being mad. So like as I said earlier, like frowning, burrowing your eyebrows, maybe squinting your eyes, things like that. But I'm glad to see that most of you guys selected running. And you guys that selected running were spot on, because running is very, very observable. It's describable, and it can definitely be something that we can measure, right? We can see when it starts, when it ends, so we can get data on how long it happens, how often, all these pieces of information that allows us to see what's happening with that behavior. Okay, so we've tackled two big questions. What is ABA? What is behavior? Now let's tackle this third question before we start to put these things together. Now, my disclaimer here is this is where it starts to get a little bit more technical, but you guys have shown me you're a sharp group. I know that you're gonna make these connections super fast. Okay, so now let's dive into the question, how does behavior work? Because I think at the end of the day, that's why you guys are here. So in order to really answer this question, I have to introduce 8 different concepts. So I have to, and we'll take a closer look at each of these. And so by the time you walk away, you'll know what each of these are. Now, the first one is contingency. The second one is a term called motivating operations. And it sounds really fancy, but you'll see that it's not so fancy. The third one is antecedent. We already talked about behavior. 5th is consequence. The 6th is reinforcement, punishment, and then the last one, the 8th, is functions of behavior. Now, as an introduction, these are not, this is not a full comprehensive list, but it's definitely some foundational concepts that will really start to help you wrap around this idea of how behavior works. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the first term, contingency. At the end of the day, contingency is merely a dependency between variables. In other words, it's just a dependency between 2 things. So 2 things, happening together, right? And there are 3 variables that, and I really should say not 2, but just, I really should say dependency between things happening, right? Or things happening together. And there are really 3 variables that we're going to talk about today that can happen together and affect behavior and essentially answer this question of how does behavior work. And the first one is motivating operations. The second one is antecedent. And the third one is consequence. So now let's take a look at how these kind of interplay with each other. So an example here, and as I move through, I'm going to definitely define each of these for you. But let's take an example, because I know for me, once you put an example in my head that I can kind of visualize, then it makes it easier to piece together, how these different concepts, these different variables, if you will, come into the equation. So let's take a look at this example. After Sam works independently for 3 hours at school, and you guys will see in parenthesis, I put what variable that is, and it'll make more sense as we move on. And his teacher instructs him to do a math worksheet independently. There's another variable. He tantrums to get out of work. So that example there really, and when you look at it, is 3 different variables that are all affecting behavior. So when we talk about when we try to answer the question, how does behavior work? We have to talk about these important variables, motivating operations, antecedent, and consequence. So now let's take a look at what motivating operations are. Okay, well, let's take a look at both motivating operations and antecedents. So if you guys recall, in this depiction here, the motivating operation and the antecedent come before the behavior, and then the consequence comes after. So just remember, motivating operation, antecedent before, consequence after. And that's going to be really important as we move on and we start to understand how all of these things piece together. Okay, so let's hone in on motivating operations. And in an everyday sense, motivating operations is something that either increases or decreases the value of something. So as an example, right, we all eat every day, but the value of food, if you look at it from moment to moment, changes. So I had my big lunch at 1 o'clock today, and after my lunch, the value of that food went down. That's the motivating operation, right? But now I'm almost close to, about 5 to 6 hours after eating, I can start seeing that value of food going up. So when you talk about motivating operations, it's something that's very fluid, right? It changes from moment to moment. So when we try to answer this question about how does behavior work, in particular if you're receiving ABA services and your behavior analyst is targeting a behavior and they're trying to understand your child's behavior, this is a variable that they have to constantly monitor and understand, because from moment to moment, that is affecting their behavior. So as you saw in the example, and what I alluded to with my big salad, my big lunch, is that not eating for 8 hours will increase the value of food, okay? Now let's compare and contrast that to an antecedent, because now that's a different variable. Now, as I mentioned before, if you guys remember from the previous slide, both motivating operation and antecedent are things that happen before behavior, but they do very different things, and that's why we have to parse them out. So an antecedent is something that, as I mentioned, comes before the behavior, but that triggers it, right? It gets it to happen, right? So an example is, even though the value of food is there, right? So let's say for my case, where I haven't eaten in about 5 or 6 hours, and the value of food is there, I'm not going to eat right now because food is not in front of me, right? Now, if food was in front of me, I probably still wouldn't eat, because I don't want to have food flying all over the place in front of you guys. But the idea is if food was in front of me, right, and I didn't have all these other things happening too, I'd probably dive right in, right? So the presence of the food is triggering my behavior, and we call that an antecedent, right? Okay. So now that you guys have gotten an introduction into the motivating operations, something that increases or decreases the value of something, an antecedent, something that actually triggers that behavior, right? In my case, I haven't eaten. So if somebody puts some good food in front of me, then, I'm going to be likely to eat it. Now let's talk about what comes after behavior, which is the consequence, okay? So now the consequence makes behavior more or less likely in the future. Now I have to emphasize that, right? I have to emphasize the fact that it's after. This is something that happens after the behavior, but it's also something that makes the behavior more or less likely in the future. So by looking at the consequence in that very way, when I see a behavior in this very moment, I can't say very much about that behavior if I only seen it once, right? I need to be able to see that behavior in the future. I need to be able to see, is that behavior still happening tomorrow and the next day and the next day, right? Or if I see a behavior today and something happens, right, there's a consequence, is that behavior not happening tomorrow and the next day and the next day, right? So to really try to understand and narrow down if the consequence is either making the behavior more likely or less likely, we have to look at what's happening in that behavior in the future, right? So let's look at some examples. So the first bullet on the slide here, when his teacher, so we'll just say Sam, since Sam was a individual that we used earlier, when Sam's teacher instructed, and I have it here, when Sam's teacher instructed him to complete his math worksheet, he engaged in tantrum behavior, and his teacher sent him to the back of the room. Now, notice what I have in red there. That's the consequence, right? Because he engaged in the behavior, and then the teacher sent him to the back of the room, and that's the consequence. But I still don't know if this behavior is more or less likely to happen. But now look at bullet 2. In the future, Sam now tantrums every time he's given a math worksheet, right? So that's telling me now the effect of that consequence, which is that it's making that behavior more likely to occur. Now, that more likely to occur, I'm going to tie it to another term as we move on. Okay, So now let's try our next ASR, okay? So now that you guys know what motivating operations are, what antecedents are, and consequence, and how they kind of surround this behavior. Thank you so much, Ivan, for putting up that poll. Let's try and answer this question. So a child raises her hand, and the teacher calls on her, and says to the child, and the teacher says to the child, Susie, what is the answer? What is the child's behavior? So I'll read that one more time because I apologize, guys. There's a typo on the screen here. So imagine Susie raises her hand, me, right? And then the teacher in the class says, okay, Susie, what's the answer? But in this scenario, what is Susie's behavior? Is it A, raising hand, B, calls on her, C, says, Susie, what is the answer? Or D, the behavior is not an example, in the example. So let's see what you guys said. Oh my goodness, you guys are so good. Everybody said raising their hand. Excellent, yes. So in here, we're interested in what the child is doing. And as we piece this together, one of the things that you guys will see is the trickiest part of answering this question about what is affecting behavior and how behavior works is really getting very kind of almost having very myopic, if you will, almost blinders to what behavior you're targeting, because you're going to see at any moment there's multiple behaviors happening, but you have to ask yourself, whose behavior are you interested in? So in this example here that you see on the screen, there's actually behavior happening from two different people, right? You have Susie raising her hand, and you have the teacher calling on her and by saying, Susie, what's the answer? So if I had said, what is the teacher's behavior? Then there you would say, Susie, what is the answer? So that's one of the things, I think that one of the trickiest parts of understanding behavior is really getting very specific and hone in on what is the behavior that you're targeting and looking at only what surrounds that behavior. So what happened before and what happened after. Okay, so let's keep going here. So continuing to answer this question about how does behavior work? Okay. So I mentioned when we talk about consequence, we can't get very far talking about consequences without bringing up two other terms, two other concepts. The concept of reinforcement, and then in the next slide, I believe you're going to learn a different concept called punishment. Okay, so let's take a look at reinforcement first. When we talk about reinforcement, we're talking about something that occurs after the behavior that makes it more likely in the future. So remember when I talked about consequence, which we know is something that happens after the behavior, we said it's something that happens that makes the behavior more or less likely to occur. So you have two sides of that, right? So reinforcement is the more side, right? It's the process that makes the behavior more likely to occur. So it happens after the behavior, and it makes it more likely to occur. So now to make this much more digestible, let's look at an example. So Sam's teacher instructs him to do a math worksheet independently. So he tantrums, and his teacher sends him to the back of the room. The next time that the teacher instructs Sam to do a math homework, he tantrums again. So because that tantruming is happening again, it now tells us that the consequence is making the behavior more likely to occur, meaning that we have reinforcement occurring, right? So what you have to remember is consequence is just talking about something that happens after the behavior. It could be more or less, but when you talk about reinforcement, it's something that happens after the behavior that makes it more likely to occur, as you see here in the example with Sam. Okay, so now that we talked about the more side, right, and when we're talking about consequences, we have to talk about the less side. Now let's talk about punishment. Now, the caveat that I have to, or maybe not the caveat, a better word is a disclaimer. The disclaimer I have to put out there with punishment is so many of us when we think about the word punishment, we have our own preconceived notions of what it is. But when a behavior analyst uses the term punishment, they're talking about something very specific, right? And what that is essentially something that happens after the behavior that makes it less likely to occur, right? So let's look at the example, and then I'll give you an example in that we all encounter in everyday life. So in the example here, Sam's teacher instructs him, and you guys will see that I kind of use the same example because it kind of helps kind of build momentum here. But so let's take Sam again. Sam's teacher instructs him to do a math homework independently, so he tantrum. But instead of sending him to the back of the room, the teacher now says, okay, Sam, you're losing recess, and he doesn't get to go out to recess. So while all the kids are having fun outside playing kickball, poor Sam has to just kind of sit there and just wait for everybody to come back in. So next time that the teacher, and so obviously Sam is not happy. So next time the teacher instructs Sam to do his math homework, he completes the assignment. So what that is pointing the behavior analyst and what that's informing us is that that is making the behavior less likely in the future. And that's how we define punishment. So now let's really kind of make this, relatable to our everyday life. Unless some of you guys are teachers, then this example is definitely relatable to you. But for those of you who aren't, you might be thinking to yourself sometimes that, well, I'm using punishment. When my child is doing something, I tell them, I don't like it when you do that, right? And maybe that could be punishment, right? But the point with punishment from the way that a behavior analyst looks at it is that we don't come into it with our preconceived notions. We do something, right? And we look at what happens to the behavior in the future. And if it does decrease, meaning it's less likely to occur, then we say, that's serving as punishment. So at the end of the day, what you have to remember is punishment is not just because, we think it's punishment, right? Yeah, when I tell him I don't like it when he does that, I think that's punishment. Maybe it could be, but to really know, when you take an ABA approach, we have to look at what happens to that behavior in the future. All right, so let's keep going here. Okay, so now that we know all these different things that surround behavior, right? We know that the motivating operation makes something more or less valuable, right? Like in the case of food. The antecedent makes triggers a behavior, right? So triggers that behavior to come out, right? And that both of those happen before the behavior. And then we learn that the consequence happens after the behavior, and you can either have a reinforcing consequence, so reinforcement at play, which makes the behavior more likely in the future, or you can have punishment occurring, which is making the behavior less likely to occur. So still focusing on this consequence, right? We have to also talk about what we call functions of behavior. And there's 4 that I'm going to introduce. And when we talk about function, a really just everyday way of thinking about function is the purpose of the behavior, right? Because behavior doesn't happen just because. It's serving a purpose, right? And our jobs as people that are trying to understand behavior and really wrap our heads around how does behavior work, we have to understand the purpose of that behavior. And the science of applied behavior analysis has really narrowed down that at the end of the day, there are 4 reasons that behavior occur. And we call these functions of behavior. And that's attention. So behavior can occur for attention. It can occur because they want access to a tangible. They want access to something, right? It can happen to get out of something, right? In Sam's case, as I've been using over and over, I don't want to do my math homework, so I'm going to tantrum, and in hopes that it gets me out of something. Now, in the example where the teacher sent him to the back of the room, that tantrum was very effective. So its purpose, definitely stood the test there. And then lastly, for sensory reasons, meaning that it gets them sensory information. Okay, so let's take a closer look at these. And I'm going to move a little bit faster because I see it's already 5:48 here. So an example of a function of behavior for attention is, if I'm going to go down to the bottom here, is Sam tantrums in class and all students laugh at him. That's giving them access to attention, right? Whereas tangible, so if a behavior is happening to get access to something, it would be Sam tantrums in class and his teacher gives him his favorite pencil or his favorite toy, right? So he tantrum and he gives him access to something, an item. Whereas escape, still using this example of Sam, Sam tantrums and his teacher tells him that he doesn't have to do his work. So it gets him out of doing the work. It gives him escape, okay? Whereas sensory, right? So sensory it's hard to embed sensory into the example with little Sam here, but a classic example of sensory is things like hand flapping, right? So if you see a child that's flapping their hands, but we also engage in behavior that is sensory as well. Like if you find yourself like tapping your eraser on the desk, I do that sometimes. Sometimes when I'm talking, I'll find myself kind of just, rubbing my nail against the back of another nail. That's sensory behavior. So it's behavior maintained by sensory input. But all these four essentially are the reason that behavior is occurring. Okay, so let's go to our next polling question, our next active student responding question here. So Ivan, if you can be so kind to flash that up on the screen. Okay, great. Okay, so let's take a stab at this question. So the functions of behavior are A, escape, extinction, edibles and sensory. B, sensory extinction, escape, tangible, and attention. C, escape, avoidance, sensory, automatic, extinction, intangible. Or D, escape, avoidance, sensory, automatic, attention, intangible. So take a stab at that. Oh my gosh, you guys are so awesome. Yeah, you guys got it. Beautiful. Yes, D. So escape, attention, sensory, and tangible. So you got it. All right. Okay. So we already touched on this. It's important to identify the function of behavior, because once we identify the function of behavior, in addition to those other variables, so like the antecedent and the motivating operation, now we're in the great position to make change. Okay, so now let's go to putting it together. Okay, all right. So motivating operations make something more or less valuable. Antecedents trigger behavior. Consequences make a behavior more or less likely to happen in the future. And when you understand behavior, you can change it. So let's take an example here. You guys know I love Sam. So Sam here, when Sam is left to work alone, he hits other, which is followed by attention in the form of reprimand and discussion. So imagine he's left to work alone. He then hits somebody else, and his teacher comes over to him and starts providing that attention. Okay, so how can we change this behavior now, knowing Sam's variables, right? His the events that essentially affect his behavior and made his behavior occur. So if we wanted to address it at the antecedent, which is what comes before the behavior, right? When Sam was left alone, well, one of the ways that we can make hitting less likely to occur is team Sam up with a buddy, right? So he's not alone, right? So he has no reason to get attention from his teacher, because he's already getting attention from someone else, right? So it's making attention less valuable, right? And because of that, it's making the behavior of hitting and getting attention from someone else irrelevant. I'm already getting it. Great. Okay, but you can still tackle it another way, right? So you can, when Sam works alone, another thing you could do is you could prompt Sam to, instead of hitting, ask a peer or adult for help or for attention, right? So we can teach Sam, and this is why the teaching component is so important. We can teach Sam that, hey, instead of hitting, you can do this instead, right? And it'll get you access to attention. But the third thing you guys can do, and you can see that you can tackle this at different points in this contingency, right? Another thing you can do is if Sam does try to hit, you can block that behavior because we have to ensure safety, and you can ignore that behavior. So we don't go into the discussion, right? So what this essentially illustrates are 3 different ways that you can go about using either the motivating operation, the antecedent, or the consequence, all to produce behavior change. So I hope this example really kind of illustrated that. Okay, so I know I had to go a little faster there at the end because I looked down at the time, and this is what behavior analysis does to me. I get so wrapped up and so excited about what I'm talking about that I lose track of time. But I definitely, Yendri and I want to get to your questions. So at this time, I want to pause to see if there's any questions that you guys would like to chime in the chat. Okay, while you guys are maybe formulating those questions and thinking about that, what I will do is, with our last few moments together, is I'd love to give you guys our contact information. So if you'd like to reach out, maybe because you'd like to get a little bit more information about what is this ABA thing, or you'd like to get more information about, our Kidvincible program, or if you just need, would like to touch base and connect with us, you can see our email address and our phone number there. Thank you guys so much. We definitely appreciate your time, and thank you, Gabrielle. You're very, very welcome. I'm glad that the presentation was helpful. And on that note, Ivan, I give the floor back to you.
Thank you so much, Janet. That was very, very helpful. I think it was very engaging, and I'm sure that everyone's very happy with all the content that you delivered today. Just a reminder, please, for those of you that are still here, just remember that we're going to keep on going on with this series, both next Friday and the Friday after that at the same time. If you're having any issues logging in or anything like that, please feel free to email me. You should have my information listed on the Eventbrite link. So at any point, just reach out to me if you're having any troubles getting in, okay? I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording now. Thank you again, Janet. Thank you again, Yendri. And then just a reminder also, if you know of anybody else that could benefit from this, please feel free to spread the word. Although we wish for everyone to be present starting today, we are recording this session, so we are open to making a few exceptions if people are really, really looking forward to being a part of this. And then just also a reminder that we're hosting this in Spanish right now at 6:15. So if you know of any Spanish-speaking families that could also benefit, please feel free to let them know. Thank you so much, everyone. Let me make sure there are no questions, okay? So we wish everyone a great weekend, and we hope to see you next week.
Thank you. Bye, guys.